What's up, Dragonborn? I am one of your hosts, Phoenix.
And I am your other host, Titan.
And welcome to our Devil's Advocate series, where we talk about games that we love and debate the complete opposite. When Starfield released earlier this year, it was a very divisive title. As I listened to both the positive and the negatives of the game, I started to feel like gaming taste might have shifted a bit. This made me immediately think about Skyrim, which is the title that so many have compared Starfield against. Like Elden Ring in our last Devil's Advocate video, Skyrim falls in our top 5 favorite video games of all time, which made it perfect to be the next topic of this series. Skyrim is revered as one of the best games of all time by most, and is still played heavily today. But we're here to tell you that just like Starfield, Skyrim isn't all that great. Also, let me put out this disclaimer based on the comments of our previous Devil's Advocate video. We don't necessarily adhere to the things that we're bringing up, but rather are taking on the challenge of debunking our own positive bias of these games. So like Elden Ring, I don't think they should have made it easier for a wider audience, but it is a very valid point that has been shared across the gaming community as a whole, so it made it into our debate. Let's start with the bugs and glitches. It's been well documented that Bethesda games tend to launch with a lot of bugs and glitches. Most of the time, these are seen as funny and even charming. What a lot of people don't remember, or they may not even been around in the initial 11-11-11 launch of Skyrim, was that it was horrific with bugs. We are talking about save-breaking, mission-breaking, game-breaking bugs. As a matter of fact, the PS3 version was so bad, it was unplayable for most, as they had a very specific bug that would continue to increase the save file of the users. The bigger the file save, the worse the frame rate, glitches, and even the ability to start the game became. Imagine if Skyrim launched in 2023 on all platforms and this bug was in the PS5 version. This would have been marked as the worst game in human history, bar none. So it's easy to say how great Skyrim is today after over a decade of updates. With that kind of attention, I think any game could be the greatest of all time.
Alright, so I want to start off by saying that all of my complaints here come down to one simple thing: repetitive. Skyrim is a beautiful game through and through, but when it comes down to it, some of it is just quite boring. So let's start with repetitive dungeons. One of the biggest problems that I have with Skyrim is the insane amount of deja vu that I get while playing it. Every dungeon was the exact same. The claw puzzles, the traps, the draugrs, just to fight a shouting skeleton at the end. But if that wasn't bad enough, don't even get me started on the caves and the spiders. After a while, it all just meshed together. It became more muscle memory than a challenge. Skyrim's open world is spot on, but when it comes to the variety and the uniqueness of dungeons and caves, it simply doesn't exist. This takes away from the immersion experience of the game. When you're set to do a quest in a cave killing 8 rats, and then you're sent to a dungeon that looks the exact same as the last 5, it gets old. And I hope that in Elder Scrolls 6, they really up the uniqueness of each location.
Skyrim's leveling system has always been interesting and unique, and one of my favorite systems, but that doesn't mean that it's good. If you don't remember, the way you level is by using skills you like and leveling them during use. There's 2 issues here though. The first is subjective, and that is, unlike previous Elder Scrolls titles, you're not locked into any skills, which means you could level any skills at any time at the same rate. This is how every build becomes a stealth archer build meme was born. Even though this gives a ton of freedom, as with most games that take this path, it leads to most players becoming the same build each time they play. The second, and this is the most important one, the skills and how they level has never been balanced. Now, I'm not going to talk about exploits to leveling because once a game is in a player's hands, they will find the path of least resistance to level quickly. But what I'm referring to is how some skills took little to level up and some took forever. Sneak was one that only required you to crouch and move, and you could get to 100 in no time if that's how you moved around the world. In contrast, if you use smithing, you would have to spam daggers to even get a foothold in the skill. This was the method at launch, and later was patched so you had to create a more complex armor in order to get bigger jumps, which would require you to find all the materials. This was a slow process. Looking at magic, using conjuring magic only required you to cast the spell of like a weapon or reanimating a body. This means you could stand in one spot and constantly spam and you would see gains. On the other hand, destruction requires you to hit an enemy target, so that one would be much slower. Don't get me started on healing yourself with restoration, as Skyrim is a very easy game and you would have to go out of your way to lose enough health to heal yourself for it to move the needle at all.
Alright, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the ungodly amount of cookie cutter quests is just outrageous. I want it to be the most powerful necromancer dragonborn there ever was. And here I am doing fetch quests for 6 hours. I'm not saying that there's no good quests. I'm not saying that at all. There are some really incredible stories. The charm of the game is being able to do what you want. But the majority of the time, you're still faced with a ton of mundane quests that have no engaging plot. You're given a rushed and unsolicited backstory that makes you absolutely not want to do the task, which technically you don't have to.
My next one is that Oblivion was better. Skyrim was not the first Elder Scrolls game, even though you would think so. It is the only game mentioned from Bethesda outside of major Elder Scrolls communities. Oblivion was the predecessor to Skyrim, and in a lot of ways it was a much better game. Skyrim was the updated version graphic-wise and dumbed down its RPG elements to appeal to a wider audience, which of course worked. But as Souls players will tell you, just because the game is set to appeal to a bigger audience doesn't mean it is automatically the best game in the series. Oblivion had a much better moment-to-moment combat. Enemies had more magic options and a number of resistances. So for example, if you had a pure warrior in Oblivion, you could run into an enemy that had resistance to physical damage and use reflect on their armor, which would cause you to take damage each time you would strike them with a physical attack. Which means not only would you not do much damage, but you would also lose HP each time you hit the enemy. In the same vein, you could have a pure mage and become silenced, which would stop you from using magic. Now you're dead in the water. Because of this, Oblivion required much more combat awareness than Skyrim. The magic system was much more diverse as Skyrim took out a ton of spells used by both the player and the enemies. The enchantment system was also much better as you could really get creative what was there to use on the offensive side. This also included a system that was taken out altogether in Skyrim where you could create your own spells. As an example, I created a bow called Tsunami that each arrow caused ice, fire, and lightning damage. I also created a spell that was a destruction fireball that had an AoE effect, and once it hit the target, would also cast detect in certain radius. So in one spell, I was able to damage my target, any surrounding enemies, and detect any enemies that I had not found yet. Both systems allowed you to really get creative. The faction quests were a lot better than Skyrim's as well, and the main quest was more nuanced, etc, etc. But you get the point. A lot of what made Skyrim the juggernaut that we know today is because of multiple DLCs, ton of patches, and over a decade worth of mods.
Alright, so keeping with the trend here, the combat system just lacks. When you compare Skyrim to a game like Dark Souls, which released the same year, it is abundantly clear that Skyrim does not have an in-depth combat system. Skyrim offers no real boss battles that you have to learn your opponent's moves and be able to adapt to different styles of fighting. Skyrim does have plenty of options when it comes to unique enemies, like guards with swords and bows, or skeletons with swords and bows, or bandits with swords and bows. Okay, yes, there are way more enemies, but you get the point. The combat fits the game, and it's how it's supposed to feel. The problem comes down to when you fight the same enemies in places that all look the exact same. You really lose the feeling of discovering somewhere new. I'm sure whoever was making the burial urns in Skyrim was extremely wealthy, considering that every catacomb has at least 100 that look the exact same.
After doing my research for the topic, I came to the conclusion that for the general gamer, if Skyrim had released for the first time in 2023 instead of Starfield, even without all the glitches and bugs, it would have been met with the same divisiveness. I believe many gamers have moved away from the Bethesda make-your-own-story style to a more in-depth twist-and-turn style story. This isn't a good or bad thing, it just means that the average player wants to be told the story and not have to create their own. They want stylistic cutscenes and a fast-paced combat with a ton of options to craft their combat style, but limited within the moment-to-moment combat itself, aka not having 100 spells and talents to scroll through, but the ability to choose 4 out of 100 to go into combat with.
Alright Dragonborn, that wraps up our Devil's Advocate for Skyrim, so if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And join us every Friday morning. We'll be there.
You be there.